This week on the Communicators, three reporters will discuss significant technology and telecommunications issues in the upcoming session of Congress and at the Federal Communications Commission.
Well, with the FCC fully staffed with 5 commissioners and Congress coming back in, we thought we'd take this opportunity on the Communicators to look at some of the telecommunications policy that might be looked at by the FCC and by the Congress. We're joined by 3 working reporters, Kim Hart of The Hill, Fawn Johnson of Dow Jones, and Andrew Noyes of Congress Daily. Kim Hart, what is the main legislative item or the main regulatory item on the FCC's agenda in your view?
Well, I guess from the FCC's perspective, they're splitting their time between a couple of things. The main piece of their time is being spent on broadband stimulus or broadband, their national broadband plan that they're putting together that is due to Congress in February. So right now they're holding, I think they maybe are finishing up this week, I think, about 23 or so workshops, pulling in industry players, anyone who has anything to say about broadband and the state of that service in the U.S. and how it can be made better and expanded to more people. So that's a big focus of theirs. And I would say another one is really drilling into the wireless industry and trying to get a better sense of the state of competition there, who the main players are, what kind of information that they make available to consumers, and what the Commission can do to make that a more consumer-friendly industry.
Well, let's start a little bit with the broadband policy. Fawn Johnson, do you see a broadband national policy coming this fall? And where does the stimulus fit into what they're working on?
That's a good question, because the actual plan is due after a big chunk of the stimulus money for broadband plans has been spent. And we all know that that's probably not the timeline that anybody in this space would have wanted, but that's how Congress set it. So we've got the FCC looking at big picture ideas. How do you get all of the people in the industry to start building out to places that they might not already do? How do you make that a sustainable profit building experience for them? Sort of big thoughts, ideas. Then you've got the Commerce Department and the USDA, who are charged with about $7 billion of grant money, actually going through applications from small and large organizations saying, I want to build a Wi-Fi system in one particular community, and trying to figure out who to give that money to. It's happening on dual tracks. I think that the idea is that the stimulus money is supposed to be a short-term hit to try and get broadband out to a few more places that might not have been there, while the FCC is really looking long-term. They're looking decades down the road, and they're also, I think, trying to change how people think about internet and make it be more like electricity and less like some service that you would pay for, but it's nice, but you don't necessarily need it. And I think that's their goal. How they get there is going to be interesting to watch. We're not really sure yet.
Do you see an activist FCC in the next 2 months?
What do you mean, activist in
the broadband area?
They're all collecting data right now. I mean, that's although.
What does that mean?
That's a good question. We don't really know, actually. I mean, they're asking a lot of questions. We are told that in the next couple of months in the fall, things are going to start to get a little more activist per se, which I think what that means is that they're going to start making some decisions about what we need to know and where we need to push. So, for example, if you're going to talk about just what is the definition of a high-speed internet access line, then we're going to start to make some decisions. Is something, your typical DSL connection good enough or not? And that's going to start to, they're going to be a little push-pull there, and they're going to make some decisions. But that hasn't happened yet. Right now, they're just asking. So
yeah,
we'll
and
see.
I think that if they don't start to actually take the answers that they're getting and take the comments that they're getting from industry players and even consumers and actually start to use those to make some decisions or start floating some ideas about what they possibly might do, the Commission might start to take a little bit of heat from the public interest groups who have been saying, you're all about, the Commission has been saying, and Julius Janikowski especially has been saying that he wants it to be a very data-driven agency, that every decision that they make cannot be made until they have sufficient information and numbers to back up their decisions and their ideas and what they're pushing out. But they've spent a lot of time on that recently, and pretty much most of their action so far has basically been asking for information and saying, we're opening this up for comment. Please let us know what you think. And so if they don't start in the next few months taking some of that and actually doing something with it, or showing the public and these public interest groups and consumer advocates that they're doing something with it that is worthwhile and pushing towards their larger agenda, they might start to get some friction from that end as well.
Andrew Noyes of Congress Daily, what about Congress? How much oversight of the stimulus money and the broadband policy are you seeing?
Well, I think that Congress spent quite a bit of time on laying out the logistics, and now they're kind of waiting to see what happens from the FCC. I would imagine that the Senate Commerce Committee and others are probably also waiting, like we are, to see a lot of the data. And I think we'll know more after February once the report is due to Congress. I also wanted to touch on the wireless competition issue, because that's another thing that Congress has been pushing very hard about. Senator Cole, who heads the antitrust subcommittee within the Senate Judiciary Committee, had pressed very hard for the FCC to look into this, and of course that, along with broadband, are kind of the two topics that Janikowski has taken right out of the gate. A third topic that a lot of people may be wondering about is net neutrality, keeping the internet open and that sort of thing. It was something that President Obama mentioned a few times on the campaign. He mentioned it again back when he unveiled the big cybersecurity report. And that's another issue that they will get to in due time.
And we're going to come back to that.
Sure.
Anything else to be said about broadband before we move on? Anything else to add? Then let's move on to the wireless issue that you brought up and that you brought up also. Both the chairman, Julius Janikowski, and the lead Republican, or the senior Republican, I guess, Robert McDowell, both spoke about wireless policy recently. I want to show you a little bit of that and then get your reaction.
The item that the notice is called a wireless competition report is that it does go beyond what CMRS is understood to be narrowly, to look more broadly at all of the elements that affect what we understand to be the mobile marketplace. It's an important step in the process of laying a solid foundation for predictable, fact-based competition policy in the wireless sector, a process that will continue, as Paul Desai said, with other competition reports that the agency is responsible for preparing. Competition is, of course, important for many reasons, including that it produces low prices and high quality for consumers. Competition is also the mother of invention, which makes it especially important in a fast-changing marketplace like communications. Today's competition notice is an essential companion, therefore, to the innovation and investment notice that we discussed earlier, and vice versa.
The Commission's long-standing policy to allow competitive market forces rather than command and control regulations to foster the development of and investment in wireless networks and services has led to remarkable advances. Thus, I hope that we will proceed with care, mindful that any future action we consider should aim to attract more private investment capital rather than deter it.
Andrew Noyes, what were they talking about?
Well, they were talking about what simply could, I guess, be characterized as whether or not government needs to eventually step in and see how competitive that space is. Some folks would argue that companies like AT&T and Verizon have a stranglehold on the market. Some of the smaller players in that space have argued that for some time. So right now, as they're doing with the broadband plan, the FCC is compiling a lot of data, and that process really began at the meeting that you just showed. So they're looking at that, and at the same time, the Republicans are saying, now let's not be hasty, let's not intervene too much, because look, the mobile marketplace is thriving right now, and that's as a result of us taking more of a light touch.
Well, and one thing that's important to remember in all of this is that wireless is getting a lot of attention, in part because it's considered absolutely critical to the broadband plan, especially in those rural areas where I don't see, fiber being connected to every home, out in rural Montana. And so it's become you find essentially two different industry sectors kind of coming together. And in the internet, there's a tradition that, with a lot of advocacy behind it towards keeping it open. In the wireless space, they haven't had that kind of regulation, and so now the commission is, they're just starting to start asking questions about where should we let the market forces ride through, and where do we need to poke a little bit and make sure that everybody has access.
And also also asking questions about what parts of the country don't have meaningful competition, or really people don't have the kind of access to wireless that they do in other parts of the country. So that's also a leg of their probe.
And one thing that Commissioner McDowell also said at that meeting was that look at how successful the wireless industry has been over the past decade. Look at how much it's grown year over year over year, which you don't see often in an economy like this. And one of the things that he argued, and it was echoed by new Commissioner Meredith Atwell-Baker, also a Republican, said, one of the reasons that it has thrived like it has done is because it has been left to market forces. It has been left to the companies and the consumers to make those decisions and take more of kind of the internet approach and work the way it needs to work. But on the other flip side of that coin, there is the argument that Andrew mentioned that not all people in all cities or towns of this country have access to 4 carriers or 5 carriers or whatever.
Or even one.
Right.
Some of them.
Right. And I think another interesting point, maybe at the micro level, something that will kind of be woven into this larger examination at the FCC is the work that they've begun looking into a particular instance that involves Apple and their popular iPod device, AT&T and Google. So there were some claims that Apple had rejected a Google application for the iPhone, and they basically requested some responses from the companies to really get an idea of what's going on in that space. I think that investigation on a very micro level could shed some light on how this commission plans to proceed in the big picture.
Right. And that was mainly zeroing in on these exclusive contracts or partnerships that a carrier can have with a handset maker, which is pretty common. Sprint has it with the Pre, and the most well-known one is with AT&T and the iPhone. And so what the commission is really trying to zero in on is, does that kind of an exclusive agreement hurt competition and reduce choice for consumers, not just in the handsets, but the applications that they can get on those handsets?
Well, it's interesting though, because I think that they're being real careful on that one, because obviously once you start talking about the iPhone, people freak out,
Why?
Well, AT&T has, as far as we can tell, it's a multi-year exclusive agreement with Apple to market the iPhone. They won't actually tell you how long it is. It's not illegal, but it's unusual. Most agreements last less than a year, and the idea is so they can share the risk between the developer and the carrier, and I think the iPhone is sort of the poster child for what's either right or wrong about these exclusive agreements, and Apple and AT&T have to kind of beat back the forces, but they do it differently. So AT&T told the FCC, well, we don't really have any choice. This is Apple's decision, but at the same time, they're the carrier. They're part in partnership with them, and they need to be. They're going to be regulated the same that anyone else is, should the commission actually decide to do something. But they haven't really made any decisions yet. At this point, they're just kind of poking, and
they've made it very clear that that's not an official investigation or formal review. They're just asking questions and trying to get a sense.
And Andrew Noyes, Senator Cole poked at this issue too, right?
He certainly did. He certainly did. He had a very high-profile hearing before they adjourned for the summer, where he brought some of the stakeholders to the table and really tried to figure out from his perspective what the state of competition is. He was very critical of companies like AT&T and Verizon, and has, as I said, really pushed the FCC to take action.
And could this lead to the demise of this agreement? Is there any sign?
Recently some of the analysts have been suggesting that the agreement is going to go away without any sort of regulation. I'm going to make a guess that in terms, if the agency actually wants to do something, that's kind of a low-hanging fruit item to just. It is true that consumers, real consumers, not lobbyists, actually complain about not being able to get an iPhone if they have some carrier that isn't AT&T. It's especially true in rural areas, and so in an agency that starts off with a consumer bent, that's not actually that's a relevant question to ask, and it's not that hard to fix. How they do it is probably going to be the focus of a lot of flurry of activity, but you know there may be some logic to saying, look, you know. All of you out in the marketplace, do what you need to in order to create these new handsets, but don't have an endless exclusivity agreement. You know, make it be some amount of time, a year, 2 years. Now, I don't know that that's what they're going to do. They certainly haven't told me that. But if just reading what they say about consumers, that's a top complaint. I mean, I get emails from readers who complain about it. I'm sure the FCC gets their share of comments.
Kim Hart?
Yeah, they haven't, been explicit about what they plan on doing in this area. And as Fawn said, it is a pretty easy fix and a low-hanging fruit for them to go right off the bat and say, okay, we're going to decide that this isn't something that we condone. But I haven't seen any indication of what they plan on doing now. I think, after the meeting, I think it was you, Fawn, who asked, what do you plan on doing now that you have the responses from Apple and AT&T and Google? And Chairman Janikowski said, well, the responses were very interesting, but that's about as far as I'm going to go on that. So it's really unclear.
Andrew Noyes, what about Congress? They could take action on this. Do you foresee that?
They could. I guess we're just waiting to see. I think that Senator Cole and others are waiting to see where the FCC goes on this. He did issue a reaction when the letters from the companies were due to the FCC. He and his staff are watching this very carefully, as are members of the House, the Courts and Competition Subcommittee. So I think it's to be continued at this point.
You also introduced the topic of net neutrality, network management. What kind of legislative or regulatory action do you foresee, if any?
Well, right before August recess, Representative Markey and Eshoo introduced their net neutrality bill, which mirrored similar proposals that we'd seen in the past. They kind of wanted to get that out there, kind of lay down that marker. From the FCC standpoint, they obviously, as we've been discussing, are preoccupied with all of the deadlines and work on the broadband plan and wireless competition. But on Capitol Hill, I think we can expect to see a lot more in this space. Senator Dorgan introduced the Senate's net neutrality bill last time around. I would imagine he'll probably reintroduce. And I guess a wild card that some have questioned is Representative Rick Boucher, who chairs the Communications Subcommittee on Energy and Commerce. He was out in front on this last Congress. This time, he's not an original co-sponsor of the Markey-Eshoo bill. A lot of the stakeholders who support net neutrality have said, Boucher's been clear on his position in the past, so we expect him to be a prominent player. But people are scratching their heads about why he's not on the front lines. A lot of other folks have said, well, he's got a lot of other issues on his plate.
Are you seeing a flurry of lobbying activity, both for and against the Markey-Eshoo bill? And simply put, what's the marker that the Markey-Eshoo bill lays down?
Well, I mean, I think, to answer your first question, no. I haven't seen a lot of a flurry of activity. I don't know if you all have seen this yet, because of the other priorities that are out there. But I would imagine that the longer the FCC stays silent on this issue, the more we're going to see from the lobbyists. And so we'll just have to.
And all the FCC has really said is reinstated the fact that it is a pro-net neutrality agency at this point.
But we haven't seen any statement, I don't think, from Commissioner Clyburn or from Commissioner Baker.
You're right.
The two newest members.
That has only
so we don't really know where they
chairman.
stand.
You're right.
And the other thing to mention, I think, is that when Julius Janikowski was asked about this at his confirmation hearing, if you go back and look at his answer, it was very careful. I don't actually think I even heard the term open in his response. He talked a lot about competition and innovation, but we actually, I mean, I think he made some statements to you, Kim. I think in one of your interviews, I'm very solidly for net neutrality, but we haven't actually gotten any indication about what he means by that. And the definition has evolved over time, such that at this point we almost need a new term, I think, to really be able to debate it.
And some of this is going to be held in limbo until the court decision comes down on Comcast, the Comcast lawsuit, in which Comcast took action against the FCC, saying that the FCC did not have the authority or jurisdiction to tell them how they can manage their network. And so that is now locked in court, and I'm not even sure when that decision is expected out. And I haven't heard anyone.
If it happens,
well, they just had to file their preliminary papers, so
it's probably not this year.
Not this year.
Yeah,
not this year.
Right. So that there may not be a whole lot of action or even lobbying activity until that decision becomes more imminent.
Janikowski has also said that he's keeping an eye on that case, so that's important. That the FCC and his general counsel are kind of figuring out how they need to proceed, or if they should proceed in any way, or just watch it.
Well, speaking of Comcast and court dates, there recently was a court decision regarding Comcast and media ownership. Fawn Johnson, what was that, and what's the net result?
Well, it was a big win for Comcast. Not a huge surprise, but the court struck down a rule that had been actually put in place by Janikowski's his predecessor, Kevin Martin, with the help of a couple of Democrats, that would cap the subscribership that any single cable operator has at 30% of the market. And the court, in a pretty strongly worded opinion, struck the whole thing down. They tossed it out, which is unusual for even for this court here. And so now there's no cap. The practical effect of that is that Comcast, if they wanted to, could more easily go in and buy a smaller cable operator like, I don't know, Cox or Cablevision or something like that. There's no other cable operator that even comes close to that kind of market share. But in the broader perspective, it speaks a lot to the ability of the commission to go forth and try and actually regulate competition. The court said that that the decision had been made, that they were arbitrary and capricious in making this decision, that they ignored the court's previous instruction to look at other markets, and they were pretty harsh about it. So if anything, I would say that, and I would expect nothing less of Chairman Janikowski, that they're going to be careful as they go forward and try and they want new players in the market, but doing something as sort of blunt as just saying, here's your cap and you can't go above this, that might not fly anymore. I don't know, but.
And that court case, I mean, that decision may not be the end of the story. I know that after that came out, some of the stakeholders that opposed that said that they're going to go to Congress and they're going to push for legislation. So.
Well, yeah.
Whether we don't know. We don't know if that's the end.
Fawn Johnson, what else is on the FCC's agenda in the coming months?
Well, I mean, we've touched on probably the biggest things that they're dealing with, but I think, as you pointed in your clip, Janikowski has teed up, there's going to be other competition inquiries that they're making. So the wireless isn't the beginning. They're going to be looking at the cable industry and probably expand that out to some of the others. But then they're engaged in some other, I would call them sort of behind the scenes type activities. They've got a big FCC reform staff that's set up to try and figure out how to change the agency. The last time they did this, it actually resulted in some legislative changes. They're just at the beginning of that, but the person who actually led the effort the last time around is doing it again this time. Her name is Mary Beth Richards. She's one of the general counsel or something for the commissioner. The other thing that they're doing is not very sexy, but could have some far-reaching implications. They're doing a top-to-bottom review of their data that they have of the industry, and they're looking to see what they have, what they don't have, and then what they might need to answer some critical questions like, is there competition in this particular space? Some of the preliminary, just statements from officials, even at the beginning, are that the data they have aren't very good. It's not compiled very well. It's old. It's scattered across different industries. It's an open question as to whether they're going to actually decide that they need to compel some data from the industry. Some of it's sensitive, pricing, subscribers. Those are all, they're not easily given up. So those are, I think those are long-term. I doubt we're going to see any real action on either of those things within the next year, but it's worth keeping an eye on because they could eventually come around and say, we need to have data on all your subscribers or all your prices or something, so that we can decide where we need to go in and tweak the market a little bit.
Speaking of data, Andrew Noyes, a new bill has been introduced by Senators Rockefeller and I believe Snowe regarding the internet and presidential powers. What is that bill?
Well, that's the most controversial part of the bill. But the bill that Senators Rockefeller and Snowe introduced earlier in the year is a very broad cybersecurity bill. They introduced it before the administration came out with its 60-day review, and so since that point, their staff has been kind of changing the bill and talking to stakeholders. There was one section of the bill that people worried would essentially give the president the authority in a cyber emergency to flip the off switch on the internet, and that scared a lot of people. I know that Rockefeller's staff didn't have the intention to convey that message, so they've definitely been finessing the language there. The latest draft of what we've seen over the August recess is a bill that's restructured in a way that puts workforce issues, ensuring that we have a cybersecurity workforce in the private and public sectors that can really thwart increasingly complex and dangerous attacks on our critical infrastructure and networks. So they're definitely massaging the bill. They've taken out quite a bit. They've added in a little bit. So we'll see where that goes. But that's definitely a hot topic and something that the administration has said is a priority.
Kim Hart, do you see the administration being interested in telecommunications issues?
Oh, absolutely. I think that it's something that the administration is watching very carefully, and is choosing carefully, of course, where it will intervene, if it does at all, or where it will throw its support for particular issues or particular stances. On the cybersecurity bill that Andrew was just talking about, creating a better developed national cybersecurity plan and a responsive plan to how they would cope with a severe threat has been something that President Obama has been out in front about ever since his campaign. He has pledged to create a cybersecurity czar position in the White House, which is still empty. And I think that is a bit of a cause of anxiety for people, saying, well, we need to get on this and start making some fixes in our systems, which we know are flawed and need more secure safeguards. And that's where, when some of these bills come out, and there are a couple others from the Homeland Security Committee also looking at ways to strengthen how the agencies look at their networks and the type of standards they have to live up to, as well as the workers who are in charge of securing them. I think that's when everyone's looking for some movement towards making our internet networks safer and more immune to the attacks that we're all hearing so much about these days.
We've only got about 2 minutes left. Healthcare and the economy are sucking the oxygen out of the room in so many quarters here in Washington, D.C. Where do you see telecom policy in the next couple months? Do you see something actually happening on the FCC and the congressional level? Plus, there are 3 unknown new players on the FCC. Robert McDowell and Michael Copps are pretty well-known commodities, I guess. But you've got Mignon Clyburn, Meredith Atwell-Baker, and the new chair, Julius Janikowski. Fawn Johnson.
Well, I don't see a whole lot of concrete action happening at the FCC until later this year. And when we see that, that's probably going to be about the National Broadband Plan. And what you're going to see is indicators. We're going in this direction, we're going in that direction. We're not actually going to see a hardcore decision, I don't think. It's just too new. The agency is just too new. The place actually I would put my money on seeing action is in Congress on the cybersecurity bill. I think we might see some floor action. I'm thinking maybe in the Senate. That would be my bet before the end of the year. So,
Andrew Noyes.
I'd like to also place a bet on the reauthorization of the Satellite Home Viewer Act, which portions of which are expiring at the end of the year. So it's essentially a statute that lets people get out of that lets people in one community see via satellite content from another, from outside their area, and it's an issue that both chambers are looking at, and bills are moving forward, and they could punt this and just kind of extend the statute that we have on the books. But I think both the Senate and Senate and House Commerce committees have indicated that they want to push this forward. So reauthorization of the satellite home viewer is where I think a lot of the action is going to be on Capitol Hill.
And I have heard that there is quite a bit of lobbying going on in that space right now. So that probably will heat up once session begins. Another thing that I don't necessarily see action on in the near future, but is going to be an interesting battle to watch, is on online privacy. And some of a lot of the consumer groups and privacy groups have just called on Congress this week, actually, some of the key players in the House, Waxman and Barton and Boucher, to take a hard look at how internet companies like Google and Yahoo and Facebook do collect your data or information about you as you're surfing the web, and how that information is used to then serve ads that you presumably are interested in. And I think that that's going to be an interesting discussion going forward as the internet companies bring out their heavyweights to prove that, no, we're doing everything right to preserve privacy, and what Congress does on that front.
Kim Hart is with The Hill, Andrew Noyes is with Congress Daily, and Fawn Johnson is with Dow Jones. Thank you all for being on the Communicators.
Thanks.